Here we go. Great.
And let's see if I can get on to the next screen. So I've been teaching and practicing conflict resolution for a number of years. And then about 6 years ago, I said, there's a lot of polarization around, and I wanted to figure out what was this all about. So I spent about 6 years doing research, looking at the science of conflict. Where does it all come from? So I looked at biology, genetics, I looked at personality, I looked at emotion, I looked at all the reasons why people might be in conflict and why we had this polarization. And I discovered 5 really major sources of conflict. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but genetic differences. Have you ever thought about that? Every single person alive today are genetically different. We may have a lot of similarities, but we are genetically different. And being genetically different means we get information through our genetic differences. And secondly, important, the way we're brought up, our environmental differences, our life experiences, all of those things that make us unique and different come from sources we have no control over. We can't control our genes. We get them from our parents. We can't control our environment, our life experiences, and all of those things genetically, environmentally, impact on how we develop our personalities. And our personalities are also different. Now, they talk about the 5 big major traits of personality, but even with those, we're all different and we see things differently. We have a filtering system. We can see the exact same thing and we develop a different opinion about it. We also have biases, prejudices, and stereotyping that we do that impacts on how we see the world. So how does somebody that supports Trump, how are they able to talk to somebody that supports Biden? How do we get into that? Now, it's completely understandable that people are going to have these differences, and it doesn't mean good or bad, but it does mean differences. So if you understand the differences, you realize that, well, how can you support Trump? Or how can you support Biden? Well, your genes, your life experiences, your personality, all of that impact on why you support one candidate over the other. And you'll have reasons. Now, they may not be what you would consider rational, but they are rational to the person who forms the opinion. I like to say that you can change the shape of somebody's bones easier than you can change their opinions. People's opinions are formed by their life experiences and their genetic differences, and there's no way you can change anybody's opinion unless they want that opinion changed. So it gets really tough when you're trying to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about bias, stereotyping, and prejudices because we all have them, and it impacts on how we have conversations with people who are different than we are. And we're all different. So what's a bias? Well, it's a preference in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. That's a bias. Now, bias doesn't mean good or bad. It just means a bias. I don't happen to like fish very much, so I have a bias against fish. That's not harmful, right? I don't like fish. Some people have a bias against meat. Some people have a bias against fruits and vegetables. Not me. I like fruits and vegetables. So I have a bias in favor of fruits and vegetables. Bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. It does become bad when it turns into prejudice, right? And stereotyping, which we all do. We all stereotype. We do that, but if we're mindful that we all have these things within us, it helps us when we're communicating with people whose opinions happen to be different than ours. Now, prejudice is when we prejudge because of somebody's religion, culture, custom. You know, it's all on the screen for you. But the bottom line with prejudice is we have to be aware of it. If you're mindful of it and you just think about it, it's going to make a difference in terms of how you deal with other people. How do you deal with somebody, for example, whose skin color is different than yours, whose religion is different from yours, whose culture, all of those things that are different? Well, by having an honest conversation, by having a learning conversation, by not prejudging the person because they happen to be from a different area. They're from the South, they're from the North, they're from the East Coast, they're from the West Coast. The idea is you're mindful of the fact that we should listen and learn rather than prejudge. Important things when you're going through trying to reach common ground, as I like to say. So I'm going to just talk briefly about hidden biases, and we all have those. Now, we're aware of our open biases, right? If you happen to not like certain things or certain people, then you know about that. You're consciously aware of things that you don't like. But there are a lot of things that are hidden from us. They call them hidden biases. Some people call them implicit biases. I like to call them subconscious things that exist within us that impact on the way we make decisions, the way our opinions are formed, and how we react to things. These are hidden biases, and I'm only going to focus. Believe me when I tell you, there are many more than these 8, but I'm going to focus on these 8 biases because I think they probably represent some of the most significant hidden biases that we have. And the first one, confirmation bias, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but a confirmation bias is we have a tendency to search for information that is consistent with what we already believe. We don't go to people to get our ideas changed. So if it supports what we think already, then it's a great idea. On the other hand, if it doesn't support what we believe, we ignore it or we give it very little weight. The confirmation bias has a tremendous impact on how we communicate with each other. So you have to be mindful of your confirmation bias. Not easy, but you can do it. Hindsight bias. This is a tendency to exaggerate how much we could have predicted, and we have this tendency. I can tell you, folks, you cannot predict the future, but once the future becomes the present, we have a tendency to look back and say, oh yeah, I knew that Trump was going to win in 2016. And then you have all these reasons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I knew that Biden was going to win in 2020. And you have all these reasons. Well, the hindsight bias causes you to look back and then rationalize after the fact. The third bias, self-serving attributions, you look at that. If I succeed, it's because of my effort. If he or she succeed, it's because they're lucky. Well, I got to tell you, luck plays an enormous amount of things in our world. We are either lucky or unlucky, and it has nothing, a lot of times it has nothing to do with skill. A lot of times it has to do with luck. But we often will say, well, we got where we are because of my efforts, but you got where you are because you were just lucky. The illusory, this actually what causes stereotyping. You think that one thing causes another. For example, if somebody's poor, that also must mean they're more prone to be criminal. If they have dark skin, maybe you think they're more prone to be criminal. And that's an illusory. It has nothing, skin color has nothing to do with ability. It has nothing to do with anything, but people have this illusion that they think it does. And if you believe something does, then it will for you. If you think it makes a difference, it will make a difference. And that's the illusory. The false consensus effect is really you overestimate the extent to which other people agree. So if I see you nodding out there, I'll say, oh yeah, you must agree with me. It may mean nothing at all. I don't know really what it means. I have no idea what's in your mind. I don't know what you're thinking. But if you shake your head up and down, I'm going to say, oh yeah, they agree. When it might simply mean I'm listening to you. I don't agree with a word you're saying, but I'm listening to you. So you have a tendency, we all do, to think that people agreeing with us when we're talking to them. They may not even be listening to us. Forget about agreeing. And the bandwagon effect, a lot of times the bandwagon, it means that we jump on the bandwagon. So if 100 people agree, then we feel, oh, gee, I don't want to be the odd person out, so I'll jump on the bandwagon too. And it has that impact. So I may not even agree, but I'm sort of persuaded. You talk about groupthink, you talk about crowds. People think differently alone than they do when they're in crowds, particularly people who have similar ideas about things. Now, how can it turn into a riot? Because what happens is you see some people doing something and all of a sudden everybody's doing it. That's the tendency to follow other people doing things. And the anchoring effect, which essentially is we have a tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information often, the anchor when making decisions. So the first thing you hear, it primes you to follow that. And the eighth one, and I would just talk briefly about it, is the curse of knowledge. When you know something, it's hard for you to understand and appreciate what it's like for someone not to know it. And then, of course, there's the worst one, which is you don't know, and you don't know you don't know. And that can be dangerous. So the confirmation bias, which I talked about briefly, which is one of the most significant in terms of how we form our opinions and how we ignore other people's opinions and why we have difficulty sometimes and why there's this polarization. Because of the confirmation bias, we seek out people whose ideas we share, we reject those ideas we do not share, and the confirmation bias creates this polarization, which is totally unnecessary. We can avoid it. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later on in the talk, how we can avoid the confirmation bias. And these are some of the questions you want to ask yourself. I think that at the end, it's being recorded, so any information that you missed during the talk, you can probably pick it up when you see the re-recording of it. And of course, you can always, you don't have to buy my book, but you can always read the book, because my book talks about things like this in a way, in more in depth, so you'll understand it in a more, I say, meaningful way, but you'll be able to get that. That's the confirmation bias, and it's one that you really have to be concerned about. I'm not asking you to scan your Twitter or think about it, but I am suggesting to you that you have to be mindful of the confirmation bias when you're having a conversation with someone who you completely disagree with. If you happen to be a blue and you're talking to a red, you have to be aware of the fact that you may be involved in this confirmation bias and not listen carefully. The hindsight bias that I talked about, I'll just briefly talk about it a little bit more. There are 3 levels of hindsight bias, which is predictability, inevitability, and memory distortion. And we all do it. We do it even if we're mindful of it, we do it. So be aware of the fact that the hindsight bias impacts on our memory. We think we know more than we know, and we don't know anything about the future. We only learn about the future when it becomes the present, and then we look back. And when we look back, we're so much smarter than we were when we were predicting the future. Yogi Berra, one of my favorite philosophers, played for the Yankees. not my favorite team, but Yogi Berra was one of my favorite players. And he said when they asked him, how do you think the Yankees are going to do this year? And he said, it's really hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So you can't do it. Can't do it. Now, how do we avoid all these problems? We do it through active listening. We listen to learn and not to judge. Nobody wants to be judged. Everybody wants to be listened to. So when you're having a conversation with someone whose opinion you do not share, listen. Really listen, so that you will understand what the person has to say, where the person is coming from, so that you can have a civil conversation. Now, some of the ways to active listening, I'm describing it here for you on the screen. Eye contact, nodding, that's an indication that you're listening to the speaker. You have patience, you don't jump in to talk. You give the person a chance to say what he or she is saying. And then you ask questions, not yes or no questions, but open-ended questions. And then you might want to paraphrase just to make sure that you understand what the person is saying. And when you do things like that, it is a way that the person says, this person is really listening to me. I may not agree, but I respect the fact that they are listening to me. So when you have this active listening, the people you're talking with are going to trust you more, and it's going to make you feel more empathetic to the other person. Active listening skills are really important in terms of your ability to communicate with people who are different than you, because you can't learn anything from someone who thinks the same way you do. You can learn something from someone who thinks differently than you do, who has different opinions. Now comes the heart of how we communicate with people. That is part of the Braver Angels approach here. Now, it's really interesting. I actually wrote my book, Reaching Common Ground, and I started writing it before the Braver Angels was formed. How did I know that my book and my concepts and my ideas became the Braver Angels? I was first. I thought about Reaching Common Ground just before Braver Angels was formed, and I discovered Braver Angels. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Braver Angels discovered me one day when someone from Braver Angels found my book, and they said, wow, Reaching Common Ground. That sounds like a book we should know about. We have to contact this guy. And I became a Braver Angels fan from the day I learned about them, because they have the concepts down pretty well. Political conversations in 6 steps, a nice guide. Now, this is really interesting. I learned this from my colleague from New York University that talked about the moral foundations for Blues and Reds. And this really 5 moral foundations or principles, which are care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity for their moral foundation. So all of these things are important moral principles. And it's interesting, those blues, and in case you're uninitiated, the blues are the liberals, Democrats, the reds are the conservatives, Republicans. So the blues, they rely primarily on care, fairness, and liberty. That's their moral foundation. Those are the 3 things that really are most concerning to them. Whereas the reds, care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, and authority. And they actually don't give much difference between those 5. So they really think about all 5 of them when they're looking at different ideas, concepts, opinions. They look at all of them. The blues primarily focus on care, fairness, and liberty. So that's a real significant difference. And if you understand how their brain functions, what they think of as important, you can reach them that way much easier than we don't understand those differences. So the step 2, and this is something that's important, which is listen to learn. Listen to learn. I'm not going to go through everything. You've got it on your screen. But I said it earlier, you can't change anyone's political opinion either. If someone's a Republican, you're not going to change them to a Democrat. If they're conservative, you're not going to make them liberal. They're not, for example, if you happen to be a strong advocate of gun control, you're not going to convince somebody from the NRA to change their opinion. They're going to keep that opinion no matter what you say. It doesn't matter whether you have facts. It doesn't matter whether you have logic. It doesn't matter what you have. They're not going to change their opinion because you've got facts that support your position. They won't do it. It's not going to happen. So the best you can hope for is you can learn from them, listen to learn. And when you're having the conversation with someone who happens to have an opinion that you do not share, in fact, you're violently opposed to it, by listening, you may actually find a common ground somewhere in there where you can start. For example, you might say somebody that's a member of the NRA wants people to deal with guns responsibly. So maybe they won't ban guns completely, but you can have a conversation about how to be more intelligent using guns. And maybe you can find some common ground. Republicans and Democrats are now trying to find some common ground in dealing with the gun violence that's prevalent right now, which is an epidemic here in the United States that has to be somehow, a solution has to be found. And you need both Republicans and Democrats working together to come to a solution, or at least to start down that road. And these are the 3 good listening skills: inquiring, paraphrasing, and acknowledgement. This is an important one. Step 3, you have to keep an open mind. Do not demonize people for having opinions that are different. You can't say, what? Are you listening to the news? All these people are being killed with gun violence. We have to eliminate guns. And if you don't think so, then you're an idiot, you're a moron, you're worse than they are. So you can't demonize people for having different opinions. It's not going to work. But we do. We often demonize people we do not agree with. So it becomes, not only don't I agree with you, I've decided I don't even like you. In fact, I can't stand you. And that's what happens. On the other hand, if someone agrees with you, not only do you say, wow, not only do I agree with you, you are smart, and I really like you. That's what happens. But if you keep an open mind, you might actually find someone that's opinion that is completely opposite yours. You may absolutely find some way to work together to come to a solution, because isn't that what we really want to do with gun violence? We really want to find a solution. It's not about who's right or wrong. What is it that we can do together to solve it? Because it's a terrible problem and we do have to solve it. Step 4, one of my favorites, which essentially is we have to use empathy. We have to look at people in a different way, in a non-judgmental way. I told you, people don't want to be judged. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be listened to. They want to be respected. And when you focus on blame, you don't really get to learn or understand anybody's point of view. All you're doing is blaming, and you don't get anywhere doing that. Step 5, speak to be understood. Tell your truth. express your feelings, and state your positive intent. You want people to understand you. They understand you better when you speak without blaming, without judging. You say, look, I understand where you're coming from. You are opposed to gun control. I just want you to understand I am in favor of gun control, and this is the reason I am. And you have your conversation, but you don't blame, you don't yell, you don't judge. You explain, you speak to the other person so that they understand what you have to say. And the step 6, you have to work together. Nothing gets done unless you work together. Problems get solved, conflicts get resolved when people work together. You do this by cooperating with each other, not through confrontation. Nothing gets solved when you're doing name calling. It only happens when you work together. Now, this is what I have learned, and I'm going to give this to you in a nice, easy to learn form, and we're going to talk about it some more. I have 3 traps to avoid whenever I'm having a conflict, when I'm trying to mediate a dispute or a conflict, or I'm having a conversation with anybody. These are 3 traps that I am mindful of that I want to avoid. The intent impact trap, the judgment assumption trap, and the binary trap. They're pretty easy, but sometimes they're difficult to keep in mind. You have to be mindful of them. Sometimes somebody will say something to you and it'll hurt your feelings. And you will immediately come to this, they did that because. For example, you're driving along, nice, peaceful, and then somebody cuts you off in traffic. And so you immediately start getting angry and mad because of the impact it had on you, yet the person who cut you off may have been completely unaware of what he or she did. But if you confuse intent with impact, you start to escalate into anger, arguments, confrontation, and it creates or can create some really serious problems. You cut me off, I'm going to cut you off, and pretty soon you could wind yourself up in an accident just because you confuse intent with impact. It may be that the person just had a bad day to start out with and is not thinking. So be very mindful of intent impact. Don't assume that someone is having something bad, doing something bad to you, that they intended it. And that's also the judgment assumption trap. You can't assume or make judgments about what somebody else may be thinking. I sometimes don't even know what I'm thinking. How am I supposed to ever know what you're thinking? There's no way I can know what's in your brain. No way. Even when you tell me something, I know what you said. I know the tone of your voice. I know the body language, but I have no idea what your thinking process was. So I try not to, I say, I'm not going to make this judgment assumption trap. I'm going to listen to you, and I'm not going to jump to conclusions. I'm not making assumptions or judgments about what the person may be thinking. I'm going to listen. And the third trap that I like to avoid when I'm doing mediation particularly is I have to stop thinking about either or. It's not, he's either good or bad. There are some things about him that are good. There are some things that are about him are bad. There's not one way or the other. It's not black or white. There are many different gradations of color in the rainbow. So instead of thinking either this possibility or that possibility, I want to think in terms of, let's think about multiple options. There's more than one way to think about this, and let's do that. So those are the 3 things I try to be mindful of when I'm doing my mediations, and also when I'm trying to have a communication with people, other people. And these are the tools that I use when I'm having conversations. 3 tools: open-mindedness, I try to keep an open mind so I can see things from a different perspective. And I want to have, number two, I want to have a curious mind, a scientific mind. I don't want to judge. I want to learn. I want to understand. So a curious mind, a true curious mind says, I want to know what you know, and I might learn something from that. So a curious mind is really important tool to use when you're having a communication, and particularly when you're trying to resolve a conflict, and the commitment to solving problems. You want to be committed to working together to find an effective resolution. So that's what I try to do in my mediation practice. And is also communicate with people who are different than I am, who think differently, because we all do. And it's not good or bad, it's just different. So now comes the good part. We got the question and answer. Let me just, okay. Let me stop sharing and we'll have a conversation. All right. Stop. I'm going to figure out how to do this one. Okay. Right. I can't. Abby, can you stop?
Yeah, I'm right. I'm here. Yep.
I'm just trying to. Yes, I'm just trying to stop my screen sharing.
Okay. All right.
Because we don't have to share that anymore.
There we go.
All right. We're good. Okay. If you should be kind, we can ask questions now. Now's a good time.
So anyone feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourselves and ask Fred a question. Fred, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So I hear a lot lately, my truth, your truth, and I get really tripped up on that personally and wonder, like, is there a truth? And is my truth, your truth, is that about perspective versus truth? Because I'm tripped up on that term.
It's a wonderful philosophical argument that people can make all the time. But there may well be a Platonic truth out there somewhere, but none of us have it, as far as I know. We all have a filtering system, and we look at life, we look at our perspective, our reality. Now, our reality may or may not coincide with the Platonic truth, but nobody, as at least as far as I've learned, nobody has the truth. They do have their perception, and we have a filtering system, and I talk about it quite a bit in my book, that they think they know the truth and they believe they know the truth. But oftentimes it's an opinion that they have developed over the years, and sometimes they don't even know where the opinion comes from, but oftentimes it comes from their life experiences. And when you challenge them and say, well, can you explain that to me? And oftentimes they're not able to, or they'll point to something and say, well, it's just a matter of faith. And that's how it works. But there is I do believe there's a truth out there, but no one can really see the whole truth. We only see our version of the truth, our reality.
Thank you.
Good question, though. Thank you.
One of the other questions in the chat is, the political conversation, blue-red differences, reminds me of Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind.
Oh, that's a great book. I think Jonathan is a member of Brave Rangers, if I'm not mistaken. That's a great book to read. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a really good book. The Righteous Mind. We all have this sense of reality, but it's our reality.
Please put anything in the chat. Do you have resources, that you can recommend for us to find balanced news?
Well, here's a thing to keep in mind. This is kind of interesting. The vast majority of people in our country are, I would say about two-thirds, they've done studies, about two-thirds of the people at least are somewhat moderate. They lean left, they lean right. There's a very small portion of folks on the far left, on the far right, that have sometimes they hijack the conversation because they make loud noises, and you'd think the 5% on the left and the right are really what people are thinking. But most people are relatively moderate. They might lean blue, they might lean red, and it depends on the issue. For example, you could be pro-life, and you could be pro-choice, and you could be anti-gun, pro-gun, gun control. So you can really have different ideas about things. You can, for example, you can be very conservative when it comes to economics, but very liberal when it comes to social issues. And it's all over the place. So, but we do things, we humans label. We just have to label because there's just too much around, too much knowledge, too much information, too much data. So we label. And when we label, we oftentimes make really significant mistakes because we label someone, you're a pro-Trump person because you voted for Trump, and yet they might have voted for Trump because they liked his policies and they may not like him at all as a human being. So you never know why people do things. Sometimes they're not sure why they do them themselves. But you haven't read The Righteous Mind out there, folks. You should read it. It's a really good book. And then we could get you to Kahneman. You could read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I have it with me all the time. And Adam Grant's book, which is excellent, Think Again.
Yes, we see behind you the library that you have, and I see Adam Grant's book. Do you have any other recommendations for those who are here among the library you have behind you?
There's so many great books out there. I was very fortunate. When I was doing my research, because I'm an academic, I could call on people that are academics, brilliant people like Steven Pinker, people like Adam Grant. I could call on them and they could recommend. They said, you should read this, you should read that. So I read so many books, I can't even keep track of all the books that I've read that helped me put this all together because there is a lot to absorb. And I tried to take all the information I was able to gather and put it in a succinct form so that you would have something. You'd write, here are the sources of conflict. These are the things that cause conflict in your life. And these are the types of conflicts that we engage in on a regular basis. And part 3 talks about the sources, the resolution. How do you solve them? So you know what the sources are? Once you understand the sources, it gets a lot easier to understand what's going on. Then you get the types of conflicts, and then you've got the solutions. And it's all in one place. And I had more fun writing it. I really did. Researching and writing, it was just really exciting for me to research it and write it. And I said, wow, I've got the antidote to the polarization. So, and so does Braver Angels. They really do. They really do have the solution. Any other questions? You've got to have many questions. No?
There's another question, yes.
Good.
Scientists develop methods for reaching factual truth. What can we learn from them?
I think that's an excellent question. That's a curious mind. That's what I was talking about when I said about curiosity. Science is that pursuit of knowledge, to learn. Now, even scientists have biases and prejudices, sometimes hidden, and they like their theories to be proven correct. So it's sometimes if something occurs and it says, oh, this confirms my theory, they say, this is great. And if it doesn't, they just throw it out sometimes. So even scientists have to be careful about how they gather the information. But I think if you look at things in a scientific way, that means you're looking at it in a curious way. And it's interesting, Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, he was really an interesting character. He's an interesting character. He likes to be found wrong, right? Most people that are out there, they're trying to get their theories accepted and they want confirmation of their theories. Well, Kahneman wasn't happy when everything he said seemed to fall into place. He liked it better when, aha, it doesn't work. And he liked that because it said, oh, now I've learned something. I've learned something else. So if you have a curious mind, and also you're willing to accept the fact that you're probably wrong more often than you're right, then when you find out you're wrong, you say, great, I'm wrong. I've learned something new. It's like Albert Edison, one of our great inventors. Every time he'd try something and didn't work, he wouldn't be disappointed. He'd say, well, now there's one more thing I know that you don't use to make a light bulb. So it's that kind of resiliency. I like to say the resilience is more important than brilliance, because if you think about it, you've got to be resilient. You got to keep going. When it doesn't work, try something else. Keep that open mind going. Good question. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Because I had one, if we're all out of questions?
For now we are, yes. And
well, that's okay. But just remember now, people are paying me $650 an hour to answer questions when I'm not doing these talks. And let me tell you, first of all, Abby, I want to thank you for putting the program on. The library is really what I consider me a great meeting place for ideas, for learning, for knowledge. You really judge a community by the quality of their library, the kind of programs I put together, and I really appreciate your volunteering to do this. And I'm going to just leave you with one more screen share if I can find it. And let me see if I can do that, because I just want to leave you with the last part of this, okay? And that is the Braver Angel's Way. Okay, is everybody getting all this? This is the Braver Angel's Way. And I'm going to give you a little time to write all those things down, but you can really get some insight by going to their website. They have wonderful programs that you can learn so much. They have, for example, pro-choice, pro-life. That's a really hot topic, and they do talks on that. And they have people from different perspectives, and they engage in constructive civil conversations. Gun control, advocate, oppose. So any of the really controversial and hot topics of the day, Braver Angels puts together a program, and they have people from different perspectives talking and explaining their positions in a civil way.